The ring had always been too big for his finger. Leo Calloway had known this since the first night he'd slipped it on, back when he was 11 years old and sitting alone in his fourth foster placement, in a room that smelled like mildew and someone else's childhood. He'd worn it on a piece of knotted shoelace around his neck instead, tucked beneath whatever t-shirt he happened to own, pressed flat against his sternum where the skin was thinner, and he could feel the cold metal even through the fabric. It wasn't much to look at. Pitted with rust along the band, stained dark with decades of grime packed into every groove. The silver had long since gone dull, the metal surface cratered and rough like the surface of some dead moon. Most people who glimpsed it assumed it was junk, a cheap toy ring, maybe, the kind that came in a 25-cent vending machine capsule. Something to be discarded. Leo had never once thought of discarding it. It was all he had of Arthur Calloway. A man he had never met, never spoken to, never sat across a dinner table from. A grandfather who had died 6 years before Leo was born, whose face Leo knew only from a single water-damaged photograph tucked inside the same envelope as the ring, a broad-shouldered man in a leather jacket, squinting against the sun. One hand resting on the chrome of a motorcycle Leo couldn't name. The man wasn't smiling in the photograph. But there was something in the set of his jaw, something steady and absolute, that Leo had studied so many times he could reproduce it from memory even in the dark. That face had gotten him through a lot of dark. Tuesday mornings at Ashford Preparatory Academy began the same way they always did, with Leo arriving 15 minutes early to avoid the worst of the hallway crowds, head down, backpack straps cinched tight, navigating the marble-floored corridors like a ghost that hadn't yet learned it was haunting the wrong building. Ashford Prep sat on the north edge of Millbrook, Connecticut, 300 acres of manicured grounds, a glass and steel academic building that looked like it belonged on a college campus, and a student body whose combined family net worth could have funded a small nation's military. Tuition was $42,000 a year. Leo attended on a full academic scholarship, one of 6 such scholarships the school awarded annually to students from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, which was a polished way of saying students like Leo, kids from the system, kids from the margins, kids who had tested into the top half percentile in state assessments and been quietly plucked from their ordinary lives and deposited into this glittering world where they would serve, whether they knew it or not, as proof that the institution cared. Leo knew it. He'd known it since orientation day, when the headmaster had gestured to the scholarship cohort during his welcome address the way a museum curator might gesture to an exhibit. Look at what we've brought in from the outside world. He had not made friends in 14 months at Ashford. Not real ones. He had, however, made enemies. Specifically one. Trent Vance was 16 years old, 6 feet tall, and had inherited his father's chin, his father's tailor, and his father's absolute certainty that the world had been arranged for his personal convenience. Senator Douglas Vance of Connecticut was the kind of politician who made speeches about the dignity of every citizen while his legal team quietly suppressed the minimum wage bill in committee. His son had absorbed this particular skill of performance and weaponized it with the focused cruelty only a teenager could achieve. Trent had noticed Leo on the 3rd day of freshman year. He had the instincts of a predator, the ability to locate, with almost biological precision, the one person in a room who could not fight back. Leo was thin in the way that spoke of years of inadequate nutrition, his clothes clean but second-hand, his shoes one size too small because the Pattersons, his current foster placement, allocated $30 per child for footwear regardless of what was actually needed. He carried his lunch in a paper bag rather than from the cafeteria. He sat alone. Trent had circled him like a satellite for 2 weeks before making his first move. Since then, 14 months had passed, and what had begun as occasional targeted mockery had escalated, the way these things always do, into something more systematic and more savage. On this particular Tuesday morning in late October, Leo was at his locker when he heard the footsteps behind him, the specific rhythm of Trent's group, 5 of them. The sound of expensive sneakers on marble moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had never needed to hurry for anything. He did not turn around. He focused on his combination lock, hands steady, breathing slow. Morning, scholarship. Trent's voice was warm, almost friendly, the way a trap is almost friendly before it closes. Love the jacket. Goodwill Fall Collection. Leo said nothing. He had learned that silence was the only armor available to him. Engagement invited escalation. Silence at least delayed it. Hey, the voice sharpened. I'm talking to you. A hand landed on Leo's shoulder and spun him. His back hit the lockers, and the impact knocked the breath from him with a sound that made two passing students look away and keep walking. Leo straightened, jaw set, and looked at Trent with the flat, measured gaze he had spent years perfecting, the expression that gave nothing away, that offered no pain for anyone to feed on. Trent's eyes dropped to Leo's neck, to the knotted shoelace visible at his collar. Something shifted in his expression, a predator recognizing an opportunity. What's that? He reached forward before Leo could react, fingers hooking under the shoelace, and yanked. The knot held for one burning second and then gave, and the ring swung free on its cord, catching the fluorescent light. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Trent held the ring up in front of his face, turning it between his fingers with exaggerated curiosity, and his friends began to laugh. What is this? He brought it close to his eye, squinting. Is this from a machine? Did you get this from one of those little capsule things at the grocery store? More laughter. Oh my God, Leo. This is your jewelry? This is what you're walking around with. Leo moved forward 1 step, 2, and Trent stepped back and held the ring high above his head, and the distance between Leo's reach and the ring was exactly the distance between his world and theirs. Give it back. Leo's voice was quiet. Not begging. Stating. Give it back, Trent mimicked, in a thin, reedy voice nothing like Leo's own. What is it, your mom's? Oh, wait, you don't have a mom. Do you even know whose this is? He turned it over again, then curled his lip. It's garbage, Leo. It's literal trash. It belongs in a dumpster. It belongs to me. The quietness in Leo's voice was its own kind of tension, drawn so tight it could have cut something. Give it back, Trent. Trent looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, the particular smile that Leo had come to dread, the one that meant a decision had been made. You know what, Trent said, I think this needs to be properly valued. He glanced at his group, then at Leo. There's a pawn shop 2 blocks down on Madison. You're going to go there after school, and you're going to sell this. He reached into the back pocket of his $500 jeans and produced a crumpled $1 bill, which he held out between 2 fingers like something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his shoe. And when they give you $1 for it, because that is exactly what it is worth, you're going to bring me back the dollar and admit that everything you own is garbage. Leo stared at him. And if you don't, Trent said pleasantly, I'm going to lose it. Like, actually lose it. Drop it down a drain somewhere. He shrugged one shoulder. Your call. In the 6 years since the night Leo had first held the ring, he had never once cried in front of another person. He had wept in bathrooms, in closets, in the backs of the social worker's car with his face turned to the window. But never in front of someone who wanted to see it happen. He did not cry now. But it cost him something deep and structural, something that held him upright, to take the crumpled dollar from Trent's hand and accept the ring being dropped onto his open palm with casual contempt. After school, the October sky was the color of a bruise, and the rain had already started. Leo walked the 2 blocks to Madison Street with the ring in his fist, and Trent and 3 of his friends trailing behind at a distance, keeping pace, making sure. The sign above the shop read Madison Pawn Trade. The bell above the door chimed when Leo pushed it open. The air inside smelled of machine oil and old paper and something faintly metallic, and the overhead lights buzzed with the comfortable reliability of things that had been doing their job for a long time without anyone thanking them for it. Behind the glass counter, a man looked up from a newspaper. He was large, not the manufactured largeness of someone who spent time in a gym, but the settled, dense largeness of a man who had done physical things for many years and whose body had accommodated this history. 65 at least, with white hair cropped close to a broad skull and a beard the same color going gray at the jaw. His forearms were roped with old muscle and covered, from wrist to elbow, In faded tattoos that had blurred at the edges with age, the ink softened into something almost like watercolor. He wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, and reading glasses pushed to the top of his head. Leo set the ring on the counter. "How much?" he said. The man, Jim, according to the name stitched on the breast pocket of his shirt, looked at the ring. Then he looked at the boy. Then he looked at the glass door, where the shapes of Trent and his friends were visible through the rain, watching. His expression told Leo nothing except that he had seen a very great deal in his life, and that this particular scene registered somewhere on a spectrum he had catalogued long ago. He picked up the ring, held it briefly, set it down. "$1, he said. Leo put Trent's crumpled bill on the counter. Jim opened the register and produced 4 quarters, which he slid across the glass. Then he looked at the ring again, and his expression, which had been carefully neutral, shifted by something that was less than a millimeter, but somehow enormous. "You sure about this, kid?" Leo didn't look at him. He was looking at his own reflection in the dark glass of the counter, at the face looking back at him, jaw set, eyes flat, and he thought about the photograph, and the broad-shouldered man with the motorcycle, and the look on that man's face that he'd spent years trying to understand. "Yeah," Leo said. "I'm sure." He pocketed the quarters and walked back out into the rain. Trent caught the dollar bill Leo handed him and turned to his friends with a grin that split his face like a wound. $1, he announced, loud enough to carry across the street. "That's the going rate for a Callaway family heirloom, ladies and gentlemen. One single American dollar." The laughter followed Leo down the block, over the sound of the rain, until he turned the corner, and it didn't follow him anymore. He stood under the awning of a closed pharmacy and let out a breath that had been building in his chest for the better part of an hour. His fists were clenched at his sides. His eyes were burning. He did not cry. He had learned, a long time ago, that crying was a luxury, that it spent something you couldn't easily replenish. He pressed his back against the pharmacy door and looked up at the gray sky through the awning slats, and he held himself together with the same careful, systematic pressure he had been applying to himself for years. He had no way of knowing what was happening 2 blocks away, on the other side of the buzzing fluorescent lights, in the hands of a man named Jim who had just put on his old reading glasses and picked up a small, rusted ring and begun, slowly, to clean it. The pawn shop was quiet after the boy left. Jim Kowalski sat on his stool behind the counter and listened to the rain and did not immediately reach for the ring. He had been in this business for 19 years, and he had developed, over those 19 years, a certain deliberate quality, a habit of pausing before touching things that had arrived with stories attached. Because everything in a pawn shop had a story attached, and some stories were better handled with care. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the machine behind the counter. He drank half of it standing up, watching the rain blur the streetlights beyond the window. He thought about the boy's face, not what was on it, but what wasn't. The absence of a particular expression. No anger, no pleading, no performance of suffering for whoever might be watching. Just a face that had been sealed shut. Jim had known that face. Had worn it himself for several years, at roughly the same age. He set down his coffee and reached for the ring. Under the fluorescent light it looked like nothing, a piece of scrap metal, corroded and dark, the surface so obscured by accumulated grime that the original shape was barely discernible. It was small enough to have been a man's signet ring, but the band was too thick for something ornamental. Jim turned it in his fingers, feeling the weight of it, heavier than it should have been for its size, dense in a way that suggested genuine silver beneath the tarnish. He reached under the counter for the cleaning kit. A soft cloth, a bottle of silver polish, a second cloth for buffing. He set these out with the methodical calm of someone performing a ritual, which in a sense, he was the ritual of revealing what things actually were beneath what time had done to them. He began at the band, working the polish in slow circles, and the first pass of the cloth came away black with oxidized grime. He worked the second pass, and the silver beneath began to emerge, dull at first, then brightening as he buffed it, catching the light with increasing clarity. He worked around the circumference of the band. The metal was solid, no repairs or welding marks. Old work. Skilled work. The kind of work that came from a craftsman who understood the difference between making something to last and making something to sell. Then he reached the top of the ring, where the setting was, and he began to work the cloth across the face of it, and his hand slowed. He stopped. He brought the ring up, close to his face. He reached up and pulled his reading glasses down from the top of his head and put them on. The silver polish had dissolved the decades of accumulated grime in the grooves of the setting, and what was emerging from beneath the dark, detail by deliberate detail, like a photograph developing in a chemical bath, was a skull. Not a simple skull. Not the kind of decorative death's head imagery that showed up on 1,000 biker rings and heavy metal merchandise and Halloween costumes. This skull was rendered with the precise, almost obsessive craftsmanship of someone who had intended it as a statement of absolute identity. The bone structure was anatomically exact, the eye sockets deep and perfectly symmetrical, the jaw slightly open in what was neither a grin nor a grimace, but something more ambiguous, an expression, Jim thought, of absolute authority. The skull wore a crown. 3 points, geometric, clean. And beneath the jaw, wrapping around the bottom of the setting like a banner, a line of text so fine that Jim had to tilt the ring toward the light to read it. 2 words. Reaper's blood. Jim's hand stopped moving. The cloth dropped from his fingers. He sat for a moment, completely still, completely silent, in the buzzing fluorescent quiet of the pawn shop, listening to the rain, while something very large and very old moved through the geography of his memory. Reaper's blood. The dead ring of the founding chapter. The original Hells Angels Charter, San Bernardino, 1948, before the organization fractured and reformed and became the thing it was now. There had been 6 men in that original charter who wore a version of this emblem, not the winged death's head that became the club's official logo, but this, the crown skull, the 2 words, the promise encoded in silver and worn on the right hand. A mark of founding blood. Of original belonging. Of those 6 men, 5 were dead. The 6th had been a man named Arthur Calloway. Jim put the ring down on the counter with the deliberate care of a man handling something that had become suddenly and enormously precious, and he pressed both hands flat on the glass and breathed. Arthur Calloway. Iron Hand Arthur. 6'4" and 240 pounds of absolute certainty, who had ridden a knucklehead Harley from San Bernardino to Portland in the winter of 1949 and arrived looking like a statue of something old and undefeatable, and who had pulled Jim Kowalski, then 22 years old, stupid, badly beaten, and left for dead in a Phoenix ditch by a crew of men he had made the catastrophic error of arguing with over a card game, out of that ditch, loaded him across the back of the bike, and driven him to a hospital 40 miles away without being asked and without wanting anything in return. Jim had never forgotten the face that looked down at him from the saddle, backlit by desert sun. He had never forgotten the ring on the right hand, either. Arthur Calloway had died in 1978 in a motorcycle accident in the Nevada desert at the age of 53. Jim had been at the service. He had stood at the back of the crowd, a man in his 30s by then, already running the pawn shop, already a long way from the life he'd briefly touched. He had watched them bury Iron Hand Arthur with the ring on his finger, as had been the man's express wish, and he had thought, that's the end of something. But the ring had not stayed buried. Somewhere, through some chain of events Jim could not yet trace, it had passed to a grandson. A 15-year-old boy with sealed eyes and second-hand shoes who had carried it around his neck on a shoelace and been forced to sell it for $1 by a soft-handed child who had never once in his life been cold or afraid or genuinely alone. Jim sat with this for 10 more seconds. Then he got up, went to the back room, and opened the storage closet. On the top shelf, behind a box of packing materials and a broken clock radio, there was an old metal lockbox, military green, corners dented, the padlock tarnished but functional. Jim had the key on his keyring. He hadn't used it in 11 years, not since the last time he'd had reason to, and before that it had been longer. He opened the box. Inside, among various documents and photographs and items he kept for reasons that were more emotional than practical, there was a folded piece of paper with a phone number written on it in ink that had faded from black to dark brown. Below the number, in handwriting Jim recognized as his own from decades ago, for when it matters. And it will matter. He took the paper to the counter. He took out his phone. He looked at the number for a long moment, running a thumb across the faded numerals as if he could feel the history in the ink. Then he dialed. It rang 4 times. Yeah. The voice that answered was low, rough at the edges, the kind of voice produced by years of cigarettes and cold mornings and conversations that happened at volume over the sound of engines. A voice that had given orders and never once wondered if they'd be followed. Jim exhaled slowly. Jax, he said. It's Big Jim Kowalski. Madison Pond, Connecticut. A pause. Then, Jim. Not a question. A recognition. Been a while. 11 years. Jim turned the ring over in his fingers. I've got something in front of me that you need to know about. Something that changes things. Talk. Iron Hand Arthur's founding ring. The Reaper's blood. I've got it on my counter. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Where did it come from? Jax said at last. A kid. 15, maybe. Foster system, from the look of him. Name's Calloway. Another silence. Longer. Leo Calloway? Jax said, very quietly. Jim felt something shift in his chest. You know him? I know of him. Arthur's daughter. She had a kid late. She's gone now. The boy went into foster care about 4 years back. A sound like a chair scraping back, like a large man straightening. Why does a 15-year-old kid bring Arthur's ring to a pawn shop? Jim told him. He told him about the boys behind the glass, the crumpled dollar bill, the boy's face, what was on it and what wasn't. He kept his voice level and factual because the facts were sufficient. They did not require embellishment to produce the particular effect they produced on the other end of the line. When Jim finished, there was a silence of perhaps 6 seconds. Send me the school address, Jax said. Jax. I'm not asking, Jim. Send me the address. Jim sent it. He hung up the phone and sat back down on his stool and looked at the ring on the counter, at the crown skull catching the light, at the 2 words wrapping the jaw. He thought about a boy in a Phoenix ditch in 1956, and a pair of headlights coming down a desert road, and a man who had not needed a reason to stop. He thought about a 15-year-old boy walking into the rain with 4 quarters and no ring. He picked up the ring and began to clean it again, carefully this time, with the focused attention of someone preparing something for a ceremony. Somewhere in Connecticut, in a clubhouse that did not appear on any public record, in a room where the walls were covered with flags and photographs and the names of the dead, a phone was being passed from hand to hand. Voices were being raised. Engines were being checked. The sky outside the pawn shop was completely dark now, and the rain was still falling, and it was, Jim thought, the particular kind of night that precedes something irreversible. Wednesday arrived cold and flat, the sky the color of old concrete. Leo had not slept. He'd lain on his mattress in the Pattersons' spare room, a room technically designated for storage that had been cleared just enough to accommodate a bed and a small dresser, and stared at the ceiling for most of the night. The room was unheated except by whatever warmth migrated through the wall from the main house, and in late October this was not much. He'd worn his hoodie to bed. He was not thinking about the ring. Or rather, he was thinking about it the way he thought about other losses, with the practiced, mechanical detachment he'd developed over the years for processing things that couldn't be retrieved. The ring was gone. Grief was a luxury. Forward motion was not. He arrived at Ashford Prep at 7:40, 15 minutes before the first bell, and spent those 15 minutes in the library running through his AP chemistry, reading with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom academic work was the one arena in which effort and outcome still had a reliable relationship. The first sign that something was different arrived at 8:15, when Trent Vance appeared in the doorway of the library and looked directly at Leo with an expression Leo had never seen on his face before. Not contempt. Not amusement. Something closer to the look of a person who has made a decision and is trying very hard to appear confident about it. Higgins wants you, Trent said. The second sign came in the hallway, when Leo passed a group of junior girls who went quiet as he walked by. Not the usual quiet, not the dismissive silence of people who chose not to see him. Something more charged, more uncertain. The third sign was the police car parked in the front circle of Ashford Prep, and the uniformed officer standing beside it, and the school administrator who met Leo at the entrance and escorted him to the main office without making eye contact. Principal Margaret Higgins had the kind of office that had been carefully designed to convey the institution's values. Oak paneling. Framed photographs of alumni who had gone on to Congress, to Wall Street, to the covers of magazines. A desk the size of a dining table, across which sat a man in a $5,000 suit who Leo recognized from the photograph Trent kept on his phone lock screen, the one of a family at a campaign event, everyone perfectly arranged and smiling the same smile. Senator Douglas Vance. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had once been athletic and had since converted the muscle to authority. His hair was silver at the temples and groomed with the precision of a man accustomed to cameras, and his eyes, when they moved to Leo, contained an expression that Leo had seen before in foster placements, in government offices, at school board meetings where they discussed scholarship students without bothering to lower their voices. The expression of someone who had already made a calculation and found the number on his end to be larger. Trent sat in a chair to the right, his expression arranged into something that approximated distress. He'd done it well, the slight redness around the eyes, the careful tension in the jaw. Leo would have given him points for performance if he hadn't been the one being performed at. Principal Higgins clasped her hands on the desk. "Leo," she said, in the tone of someone who had been practicing it, "thank you for coming. I think you know why we're here." "I don't," Leo said. He had decided, sometime around 2 in the morning, that whatever was coming, he would not perform distress either. He would give them nothing. Trent's Rolex. She folded her hands more tightly. His submariner, which went missing from the locker room yesterday. Leo looked at Trent. Trent met his gaze with an expression of barely contained hurt. "I saw you near my locker," Trent said. After second period. I didn't want to believe it, but he let the sentence trail into a performative pause that cost him nothing. The watch. Leo almost allowed himself to feel something like surprised, except that he wasn't, not really. This was the escalation he'd been expecting, not this exact shape, but this grade of it. The moment when Trent decided that humiliation alone wasn't sufficient. The moment when the game changed from cruelty to destruction. "I didn't take anything," Leo said. "Leo." Higgins' voice carried the gentle reproach of someone who had already decided the outcome and was now navigating the formality of the process. "The officer outside has been briefed. Senator Vance has been very generous in agreeing to handle this, institutionally before involving the police formally, but he could have stolen anything." Senator Vance spoke for the first time, directly, cutting across his son's carefully calibrated distress. His voice was the voice of a man who interrupted people as a habit, reflexively, without registering the rudeness of it. He turned to Principal Higgins. "Margaret, I think we all understand what needs to happen here." "Of course," Higgins said. And then Senator Vance opened his briefcase and placed a check on the desk. Leo looked at it. He did not look at the number written on it, because the number was irrelevant. The check itself was the entire argument, the statement, made as plainly as anything ever got said in rooms like this, that the transaction had been completed before the meeting had begun, that the outcome had been purchased, that Leo was, and had always been, a problem to be priced and resolved. "A donation to the school's new science wing," Vance said pleasantly. "Which I believe you've been hoping to build for some time now, Margaret." He leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man in his own living room. "In exchange for which, this matter is handled quietly. The boy is withdrawn from the program, a note is added to his academic file, and we all move on. No police, no juvenile record, he gets to walk away clean." He spread his hands. "That's more than generous." Higgins looked at the check. The check was enormous. Leo could see it in her eyes, the specific, awful sight of a person's principles being weighed against something else and found lighter. "What about Leo's scholarship?" said a voice. Everyone turned. It was Miss Chin, the AP chemistry teacher, who had followed them down the hall and now stood in the office doorway. She was 32, small, with the quietly stubborn manner of someone who chose her battles carefully and had determined, today, that this was one of them. This is a private meeting, Higgins said. Leo is my student, Chen said. And I'd like to know if there's any actual evidence, because… Thank you, Rebecca. Higgins' voice had gone flat and hard in the way of a command. That will be all. Chen looked at Leo for a moment. Her expression was an apology, not for lack of effort, but for lack of power. Leo gave her nothing back. Not because he was angry at her. Because he didn't want her to feel worse. The door closed. Leo, Higgins said, with what was intended to sound like sympathy, I think, given your circumstances, you should consider. I didn't take the watch, Leo said. I've never touched anything in that locker room that wasn't mine. You don't have evidence because there isn't any evidence. We have Trent's testimony. Trent's testimony is a lie. Leo's voice remained level. Not loud. Not shaking. Just flat and exact, each word placed with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to be careful about. You're going to expel me and send me back into the foster system over a lie because his father wrote a check. I want that to be very clear. I want to make sure everyone in this room understands exactly what is happening. Vance's expression didn't change. Trent's did. Something flickered in it, brief and unreadable. Higgins looked at the check. I'm going to call the social worker, she said finally, in the tone of someone closing a door. And I think, Leo, that, given everything, a fresh start elsewhere might actually be the best thing for you. Leo looked at her. He looked at Vance. He looked at Trent. He looked at them all with the same flat, sealed expression he'd worn since yesterday, and he thought about the ring, and the photograph, and the jaw of the man in the photograph who had never smiled. Okay, Leo said quietly. He was led to the hallway to wait while Higgins made her calls. He sat in a plastic chair outside the office and looked at his hands and listened to the building's sounds, the distant thrum of classes in session, the radiator ticking, the murmur of voices through the closed door. He had been here before. Different buildings, different chairs, different doors. The feeling was the same. The feeling of institutions deciding your future in a language you weren't invited to speak, while you sat in a hallway and waited to be told what had been decided. He was still looking at his hands when, from somewhere far away, beyond the building, beyond the grounds, beyond the careful manicured buffer of Ashford Preparatory Academy's 300 acres, there came a sound. Low at first. Below the threshold of certain identification. More of a vibration than a sound, something the body felt before the ears confirmed it. Leo lifted his head. The vibration deepened. The window at the end of the hallway began, almost imperceptibly, to tremble in its frame. And then the sound arrived, the full-throated, earth-shaking, unmistakable roar of 100 heavy engines all speaking at once, growing louder with every passing second. The sound of something enormous moving with purpose and without apology through the streets of Millbrook, Connecticut. Leo stood up from the chair. Through the hallway window, he could see the front grounds of Ashford Prep. He could see the police car in the front circle, and the officers standing beside it, and the officer's head turning slowly toward the gate. And then the first motorcycle came through. They came in from 3 directions. The east entrance, the West Service Road, and straight down Millbrook Avenue from the north, a column of heavy Harleys 4 bikes wide, their engines generating a collective sound that was less like noise than like weather. Like the onset of something meteorological, something that moved the air. Leo stood at the hallway window and watched. They were dressed in the uniform of their tribe, black leather, patches, boots engineered for durability rather than appearance. They rode with the unhurried, absolute confidence of people who had never once wondered if they had the right to take up space. There were no aggressive maneuvers, no theatrical weaving. Just forward motion, straight and inexorable, the way a river is forward and straight. The leading column, 12 bikes at the front, ridden by men whose collective age averaged somewhere around 50, whose cumulative scars and tattoos and road miles represented a kind of lived history that could not be purchased or simulated, pulled to a halt in a precise arc across the main entrance of the school. Behind them, bikes filled the entire front sweep of the driveway and spilled out along the street in both directions. Leo counted. He stopped at 200. There were more. The police officer had his radio to his mouth. He was not moving. His face had the particular immobility of someone who had just recalibrated what they were dealing with and was waiting for guidance from a chain of command that was, at this moment, equally uncertain about what to do. The door of the principal's office opened. Higgins, Vance, and Trent emerged into the hallway, drawn by the sound. Vance had his phone out, speaking rapidly in a low voice, the voice of a man calling in resources, activating the machinery of his own protection. Trent was behind his father, and his face had lost the careful performance it had been maintaining all morning. What was on it now was raw and unscripted. Higgins was at the window next to Leo, her hand pressed against the glass. "What in God's?" she began. The engines went silent. All of them, simultaneously. The sudden absence of sound was almost louder than the sound had been a pressure release, a held breath, and in that silence the school felt very small. The front door of the main building opened, and three things happened in rapid succession. First, the two men who served as Senator Vance's personal security, plain-clothed, earpieces, the kind of men whose job had always previously been adequate, stepped into the hallway and moved toward the entrance. Second, the doors at both ends of the hallway swung open, and men in leather jackets came through them. Not running. Walking. With the measured pace of people who had determined that pace was the appropriate choice and were not interested in revising that determination. Third, in the resulting geometry security between Vance and the exit, men in leather blocking both corridor ends, Senator Douglas Vance of Connecticut found himself, possibly for the first time in his adult life, in a position that his money and his title and his practiced authority could not immediately resolve. He was not a man accustomed to this position. The shock of it was visible in his face the way structural damage is visible in a building, not dramatic, not immediate, but perceptibly wrong. "What is this?" he said. To his security. To Higgins. To the room in general. Nobody answered him. The men at the corridor ends did not advance. They held the exits and waited, arms at their sides, with the patient absolute stillness of people who had learned, through long experience, that sometimes simply not moving was enough. Then the front door of the building opened again. He came in alone. Jackson "Jax" Reeves was 40 years old and had been president of the Connecticut Charter of the Hells Angels for 9 years. He was 6'2", 230 pounds, and gave the impression of being larger than his measurements, not through any physical trick of posture or breadth, but through some quality of presence, a density of self that occupied space differently from most people. His leather vest was old and heavy with patches, the names of the dead stitched alongside the colors of the living. His face was all hard planes and long experience, the face of a man who had stopped performing anything for anybody a very long time ago. He walked down the hallway without hurrying, and the school building, which had been designed and operated under the assumption that the world which produced Trent Vance was the real world, was the world that mattered, felt, for the first time in its existence, like a theater set. Thin and provisional and existing at the mercy of forces that had never been consulted about its construction. He stopped in front of Leo. Leo looked up at him. Jax looked down at Leo. For a moment they just looked at each other, the 40-year-old man in leather and road miles and history, and the 15-year-old boy in second-hand clothes and sealed eyes. Then Jax reached into the inner pocket of his vest and took out the ring. It had been cleaned, not just to the dull gleam Jim had achieved, but properly, carefully, with the deliberate attention of someone for whom this particular task had significance. The silver was bright now, the kind of brightness that catches light and holds it. The crown skull on the setting was sharp and clear, the eye sockets deep, the wrapping text legible from several feet away. The black obsidian accents in the crown's points caught the hallway fluorescence and turned them into something colder and more permanent. It was beautiful. Leo had not known, until this moment, that it was beautiful. Jax held the ring in his palm, and then, with the deliberate slowness of a man who understood the weight of the gesture, who had thought about this gesture on the ride here and chosen it with precision, he went down on one knee. In the hallway of Ashford Preparatory Academy, in front of the principal and the senator's son and 2 immobilized bodyguards and a corridor of watching leather-jacketed men, Jackson Reeves of the Connecticut Hells Angels knelt before a 15-year-old foster child and extended the ring on his open palm. "Leo Calloway," Jack said. His voice was steady and quiet and carried the hallway without effort. "This ring belonged to Arthur Calloway, who we called Iron Hand Arthur, who was there at the beginning and who was my predecessor's predecessor's predecessor, and who we do not forget." He paused, and something moved in his face that was not softness exactly but was adjacent to it. "It's yours by blood. It always was. Nobody had the right to take it from you." Leo looked at the ring. He looked at it for a long time. His face was doing something complicated, a series of small, rapid negotiations between the expression he had trained it to show and the expression it wanted to, the sealed surface cracking along fault lines he hadn't known were there. He reached out and took the ring. It was heavy in his hand. Heavier than he remembered. Or perhaps just differently heavy, not the weight of something worn and carried, but the weight of something understood. He looked at Jax. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was steady, but only barely. "Someone who owes your grandfather a debt that can't be paid off," Jax said, and stood back up. He looked at Leo for another moment, and what Leo saw in his face was a kind of recognition, the specific recognition of someone seeing in another person a resemblance to someone they had known and mourned. Then Jax turned around. He looked at Senator Vance. The senator had not moved from his position in the corridor. He still held his phone. He had the expression of a man waiting for the cavalry, the authority, the institutional machinery that had always reliably arrived when summoned. His jaw was set, and his eyes were calculating, and somewhere in his face was still the assumption that this could be managed. Jax walked toward him. He stopped 3 feet away. He looked at the senator the way you look at a piece of road, something to be covered, something beneath consideration as an equal, something that simply exists between here and where you're going. "Senator," he said pleasantly, "you and I need to talk." They moved the meeting to the gymnasium. Not by general agreement, but by the gravitational logic of the situation, Jax walked toward the gym, and everyone else followed, because that was the kind of authority he carried. The senator's security had been gently but definitively separated from their employer by 2 of the largest men in leather that Leo had ever seen. And Vance himself walked between them with the rigid posture of a man performing composure and not quite achieving it. Trent walked behind his father. Leo had looked at Trent twice since Jax arrived. The first time, Trent had been arranging his face back toward contempt, the reflex of a person whose self-image depends on contempt. The second time, after the kneeling, after the ring was in Leo's hand, Trent's face had lost the arrangement entirely and was simply a 16-year-old face, which was to say, younger than it usually allowed itself to look, and afraid. The gym was high-ceilinged and echoing, its bleachers folded away, the polished hardwood floor reflecting the overhead fluorescence with mirror precision. It smelled of rubber and cleaning products and the specific institutional cleanliness that exists to suggest that difficult things don't happen here. Several of the most senior leather-jacketed men filed in and took positions along the walls. They did not crowd the space. They defined it, their presence creating a perimeter that was not aggressive and did not need to be. Principal Higgins stood near the door, her arms crossed, her face cycling through expressions with the speed of someone running an internal calculation that kept returning an unwanted result. Jax stood at the center of the gym floor. He waited until the room had settled, until the shuffling and positioning stopped, and the only sounds were the hum of the fluorescence and distant, muffled engine sounds from outside. Then he reached into his vest pocket again and took out a single object and held it up. A $1 bill. Crumpled. The same one. Jim had kept it. Had given it to Jax along with the ring. "This," Jax said, "is the price you put on Arthur Calloway's blood." Senator Vance's expression tightened. "I don't know what you think. I'm not talking to you yet." Jax's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm establishing context." He turned to look at Trent. "You want to come up here?" Trent didn't move. "Trent." Jax's voice was even and calm. "Come up here." Trent came up. He stood in front of Jax with his hands at his sides and his chin at an angle that was trying to be defiant and achieving something several degrees short of it. He was taller than Jax by perhaps 2 inches, but the height was doing him no favors. "You took this ring," Jax said. Trent's voice came out higher than he'd intended. He stopped and tried again. "I didn't take anything. He gave it to me." "He gave it to you," Jax repeated. To sell it. For the dollar." A pause. "It was his idea." "His idea." Jax looked at the dollar bill. He looked at Trent. He looked at Trent with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had spent decades in the company of men who lied and had developed an extremely accurate instrument for detecting it. "Let me tell you what I know about that ring. That ring was made in 1947 by a silversmith named Eddie Farrell in San Bernardino. It weighs 62 grams. The obsidian in the crown came from a mine in New Mexico. It was given to Arthur Callaway by the original founding members of a charter that has been in continuous existence for more than 70 years. When Arthur died, it was buried with him, which means somebody went to considerable effort to get it back, which means it ended up with Leo for reasons I don't entirely know yet, but intend to find out." He paused. "A 15-year-old kid with nothing carried this ring around his neck on a shoelace, because it was the only thing connecting him to a family he never got to have. And you took it from him and made him sell it for $1. Jax placed the bill on the gym floor between them. "So I want you to tell me again that it was his idea." Trent's jaw worked. His eyes went to his father, a fast, involuntary glance, the look of a child reaching for a parent's hand. His father was not looking at him. His father was looking at the men along the walls, running the same calculation he'd been running since this began, still looking for the lever that moved the machinery in his favor. "I also want to talk about a Rolex," Jax said. The word landed in the gym like a stone dropped in water. Trent went very still. "I want to talk," Jax continued, in the same even, conversational tone, "about how a watch that a 16-year-old kid reported stolen this morning is, according to people I trust who have been doing some research since early this morning, sitting in a locker at the school. Not Leo's locker. A different locker. A beat. You want to tell me whose?" Trent said nothing, but his face, his 16-year-old face, stripped now of every performance, said everything. "Say it out loud," Jax said. "In front of these people. In front of Leo." The silence stretched. Then Trent's father stepped forward. "This is enough," Vance said. His voice was controlled and authoritative, the voice of a man exercising the tool that had never failed him. "I don't know who you people think you are, but you have no standing here. You have no legal authority. What you are doing right now constitutes intimidation, obstruction, and—" Jax reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He placed it on the bleachers, the screen facing outward, displaying a photograph. Vance stopped speaking. The photograph was of Vance at a fundraiser. He was shaking hands with someone. The someone's face was not important. What was important was the timestamp in the corner and the context it established, the context that Jax had briefly explained to Vance while they were walking to the gym, speaking quietly and with the unperturbed manner of a man reading a weather report. It was not blackmail. Jax had been careful about that. It was simply information, shared calmly, about the kind of detailed and dedicated attention that a large number of very motivated people with no particular respect for conventional limitations could bring to bear on a public figure's activities. The kind of attention that didn't require courtrooms or legal standing. The kind that moved differently. Vance looked at the photograph. He looked at Jax. Something left his face, the last remnant of the calculation, the final assumption that the math would resolve in his favor. He looked, for the first time, like a man who was out of moves. "What do you want?" he said. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but different, controlled the way a person controls themselves when they're frightened, not the way a person controls a room. "I want what's already true to be said out loud," Jax said. "That's all. I want your son to stand up in front of these people and tell the truth." He glanced at Higgins. "I want the principal to hear it. And then I want certain things to happen as a result of it, which they should have happened already but didn't, because this is the kind of place and these are the kind of people who made sure they didn't." He turned back to Trent. "Well," he said. Trent Vance, son of a senator, student of Ashford Preparatory Academy, stood on the gymnasium floor in his expensive shoes and his well-cut shirt, and he looked at his father, who offered him nothing, and he looked at Leo. who was standing near the door watching him with those flat, sealed eyes, and the particular armor that money and position and the long habit of consequence-free cruelty provides, cracked along every seam at once. When Trent began to speak, his voice was very small. It took 11 minutes. That was how long Trent Vance spent on the gymnasium floor, in front of Principal Higgins and the assembled witnesses, telling the truth about 14 months of systematic targeting, about the ring, about the $1, about the Rolex planted in Leo's general vicinity, because he'd been afraid after the motorcycle sound started that he needed a larger accusation to make things stick. 11 minutes of the kind of confession that can only happen when every alternative has been foreclosed, when there is nowhere left to perform and nothing left to perform for. He didn't look at Leo while he spoke. Leo didn't need him to. Higgins listened. Her face went through several stages: discomfort, recognition, the specific expression of someone understanding the extent to which they have allowed themselves to be used. She looked at the check on the desk in her office, which she could still presumably see through her memory of the last half hour, and her expression settled into something harder and more honest than anything Leo had seen on her face before. "The scholarship stands," she said, when Trent finished. Her voice was flat and final. "Obviously." "And?" Jax said. Higgins straightened. "Trent Vance is suspended pending a formal disciplinary review. The police officer outside will be briefed on the false report." She paused. "And I'll be speaking with the state scholarship board about ensuring our scholarship students have adequate support mechanisms." She did not look at Vance when she said this, which was its own kind of statement. Vance was sitting on the bleachers now. At some point in the last 20 minutes, he had sat down, not been made to, but simply arrived at a seated position the way people do when the architecture of a situation has shifted beneath them and standing no longer feels natural. He was not on his phone. His security was in the hallway, separated from him not by force, but by the understanding that force wasn't necessary when the geometry was correct. Jax walked to where Vance sat. He reached into his pocket and produced the $1 bill, Trent's crumpled dollar, the price of Leo's grandfather's ring, and he held it out. "You're going to want this back," Jax said. Vance looked at the bill. He did not take it. Jax placed it on the bleacher beside him, carefully, with the deliberate precision of a man making a point that didn't require words. "Let me tell you something about the world you live in," Jax said. Not loudly. Not with performance. In the plain, even voice of someone making an observation about geography. "There's the part of it where your money works. Courts. Campaigns. Schools. People's careers. All of that. And then there's the part of it where it doesn't." He looked down at Vance without any particular anger, which was, Leo thought, somehow more complete than anger would have been. "You've been running your whole life in the first part. You sent your son to a school where you thought the second part couldn't reach him." A pause. "You were wrong about that." He straightened. "Arthur Calloway's grandson is not going to be touched again," he said. Not to Vance specifically. To the room. Not by your son. Not by anyone at this school. Not by whatever system he's been running through. He let that land. If he's got a problem, any problem, with anyone in any of those categories, he calls the number I'm going to give him. One call. He looked at Leo. One call and we come. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of logistical fact, delivered in the tone of someone describing a contractual arrangement. Senator Vance looked at the dollar bill sitting beside him on the bleachers. Then, in one of the few genuinely unscripted moments of his political career, he picked it up and held it and looked at it, and his face, the face of a man who had spent decades arranging the world to confirm his own sense of it, showed something Leo had no name for because he had never seen it on a face like that before. It looked, Leo thought, like the beginning of understanding something. After the gymnasium. There was a meeting in a conference room, smaller, practical, between Jax and the school's legal counsel, who had appeared at some point and who proceeded to have a conversation that Leo was not present for but whose outcome Higgins communicated to him afterward. The scholarship would be honored through graduation. A formal record correction would be filed with the state education board, and 3 additional school security staff positions would be created and funded, not by Senator Vance's check, which had been returned, but from the school's existing endowment. There was a second meeting, also without Leo, between Jax and a woman who introduced herself as Leo's caseworker at the Department of Children and Families. This meeting was also brief. The caseworker had received, prior to the meeting, a packet of documentation that Jax's people had assembled quietly, efficiently, in the hours since Jim's phone call, regarding the Pattersons' household. The documentation was thorough and detailed and included financial records, testimony from a neighbor, and 3 years of school nurse reports that someone should have connected much sooner. The caseworker, to her credit, did not require a lengthy meeting. Outside, in the school parking lot, Trent Vance sat in the back of his father's car and did not speak. The car did not leave immediately. It sat in the lot for 20 minutes while Senator Vance made phone calls in the front seat, each one shorter than the last, each one ending with a version of the same expression. At one point Trent looked up through the car window and saw Leo standing on the steps with Jax, and their eyes met. Leo held the look for a moment. Then he looked away. Not because he needed to demonstrate something, but because there was nothing left to demonstrate, and he found he didn't need it. There was a third thing, which happened after the cars had mostly gone and the last of the motorcycles idled at the school gate. Jim Kowalski arrived, driven by one of the younger members, since Jim had stopped riding years ago, and walked up to where Leo was sitting on the front steps in the October cold. He sat down beside him. They were quiet for a minute. "You knew him," Leo said. "A long time ago," Jim said. "I didn't know him well. One night, about 70 years back now. But some nights are worth more than a lot of days." He paused. "He was something, your grandfather. The kind of person who makes you feel like things can actually be what they ought to be, not just what they are." Leo looked at the ring on his hand. He'd put it on his right ring finger, where it was slightly too large, the way things inherited often are. "I didn't know anything about him," Leo said. "There was just the ring and the photograph. My mom, she never talked about it. And then she was gone." A pause. "And then there was just the ring." "Well," Jim said carefully, "there's more than that now." Leo looked at him. Then he looked at the gate, where Jax was talking to 2 of his men, gesturing with the particular economy of motion that characterized everything he did. "What do they actually want from me?" Leo said. Not suspicious. Genuinely asking. People don't just show up. There's always something they want. Jim thought about this. "I think," he said, "they want you to exist. To grow up and be what Arthur's blood runs to. They want someone to have mattered Arthur, and the things he stood for, and the way he lived, in a way that outlasts the people who were there for it." He looked at his hands. "When everything from something you were part of gets old and fades, the people die, the records get lost, nobody's left who actually remembers, and then something shows up and says, no, it didn't end, it carried forward." He stopped. "That means something. More than I can tell you it means." Leo sat with this. The October cold was coming off the lawn in waves, and the last light of afternoon was making long shadows across the school's manicured grounds, and somewhere the sound of a motorcycle engine turned over and settled into a patient idle, waiting. They did not rush him. This was the thing Leo kept returning to, in the days and weeks after, that nobody rushed him. Nobody showed up at the Pattersons' door, which he was removed from within 48 hours of the meeting, placed in an emergency single-room foster arrangement while the case proceeded, and told him what to think, or what to feel, or what the ring meant, or what he was supposed to do next. Jax had given him a phone number on a card that read only Jax and a 7-digit number, and that had been the extent of the instruction. "One call," he had said. "And we come." Leo called 3 weeks later. Not for anything dramatic. He'd found, in the new placement, a girl named Maya, 13, 2 placements ahead of a group home, who was being targeted by the older kids on the block. He'd intervened twice on his own, which had worked, sort of, but the situation was escalating, and he was 15 and the other kids were 17, and the math was unfavorable. He called the number. 2 hours later, a single motorcycle rolled quietly onto the block and parked. The rider, a woman in her 30s, powerfully built, with 2 sleeves of tattoos and an expression that suggested she had seen and dispensed with much larger problems than this, went and had a brief conversation with the older kids. Leo wasn't there for the conversation. He heard about the aftermath. The older kids had relocated their social activities to a different block and seemed disinclined to return. Maya had asked Leo what happened. Leo had said he'd called someone. Maya had looked at him with the specific, assessing gaze of a kid who has learned to measure trustworthiness in very small increments, and she had said, "Are you actually going to be here for a while?" And Leo had said, with more certainty than he'd said anything in a long time, "Yeah, I think I am." The legal proceedings moved at their own pace, the pace of institutional machinery grinding through reality, but they moved. Senator Vance did not escape consequence, though the consequence he faced was calibrated not by law alone but by the particular kind of accountability that arrives when the subject's activities are of sustained, detailed, and completely inexhaustible interest to a large number of people with no political career to protect and no election to worry about. The State Ethics Board received several anonymous tips, each backed by documentation too precise and too well organized to ignore. 2 of the tips concerned campaign finance irregularities. 1 concerned a real estate transaction. The investigations were ongoing as of the following spring. Trent was not expelled, ultimately. He was suspended for 2 weeks and mandated to a conflict resolution program and school counseling. Leo would have found this insufficient if he'd spent more time thinking about it, but he found that he didn't spend much time thinking about it. What had happened to Trent was less interesting to him than what had happened to himself, which was, a door had opened. He began going to the clubhouse on Saturday afternoons. Not every Saturday, just when Jax texted and said coming by. In the particular minimalist way of a person who was extending an invitation without pressuring an acceptance. The clubhouse was a converted warehouse on the east side of Millbrook, nothing like what Leo had expected from everything he'd heard about biker clubs. The garage smelled of engine oil and metal and the specific irreplaceable smell of old leather that had been worn through 1,000 miles of weather. The men and women who moved through it were, Leo learned over weeks and months, mostly working people. Mechanics, construction workers, a couple of retired military, a nurse, an electrician. People who had built their lives around the specific gravity of loyalty and the specific comfort of being somewhere you were not required to perform anything. Jim came on some Saturdays too. He and Leo developed the kind of friendship that doesn't require much narrating, the kind where 2 people sit in the same room and do different things and occasionally say something and find that the something lands right. One Saturday in late November, when the garage was warm from the space heaters and someone had put a record on an old turntable, Jim asked Leo about school. Leo said it was fine. He said Miss Chen's AP chemistry class was genuinely interesting. He said he'd been offered a position on the academic decathlon team and was considering it. Jim said, "Your grandfather couldn't read until he was 19. Leo looked at him. He taught himself, Jim said. Carried a dictionary in his saddlebag for 7 years. Wouldn't stop until he could read anything. He shrugged. He said the best thing in life was being able to understand more than people expected you to." Leo thought about this. He thought about the photograph, the broad-shouldered man with the motorcycle, squinting against the sun. The jaw that didn't smile but held something steady and absolute. He thought he understood it better now. Not the absence of a smile, but the quality of what replaced it. The particular expression of a person who has found, after much difficulty and many miles, something solid to stand on. He looked at the ring on his hand. He had thought, before all of this, that the ring was a connection to a past that was sealed and gone, to a man he could never know, a family that had never fully existed for him, a life that had been subtracted before he arrived. He had worn it because it was all he had, and you hold on to what you have. He understood now that that had been wrong. Not entirely wrong, but insufficient. The ring was not the past. It was, or it was becoming, a kind of direction. A statement of something ongoing, something that moved forward rather than backward. The crown skull on the setting was not a death's head in the way that meant ending. It was a death's head in the way that meant, I have been through things that would have ended a lesser story, and I am still here, and this is what I carry, and this is where I come from. Come from meant something different to Leo now than it had 6 months ago. Before, it had meant absence, the long list of what he didn't have, who hadn't stayed, what hadn't held. Now it meant something more complicated and more solid. It meant Arthur Calloway riding through a Nevada winter. It meant Jim on a stool in a pawn shop at 65, still keeping the number. It meant a 40-year-old man in leather going down on one knee in a marble hallway not because he had to but because it was correct. It meant a 15-year-old girl named Maya asking if he was going to be around for a while. It meant being around for a while. In the spring, Leo turned 16. Jax gave him something on his birthday, not the ring, which was already his, but something else, a photograph he'd never seen before. Arthur Calloway, younger, mid-20s maybe, in a leather jacket, sitting on a motorcycle on a strip of desert highway, grinning directly at the camera with the ease of someone who has nowhere to be but here. Not the stern-jawed man from the water-damaged photograph. A different version, earlier, lighter, before whatever had come later and settled into permanence on his face. It was the grin that got Leo. He'd never imagined the man grinning. He sat with the photograph for a long time that evening, in his room in the new foster placement, a house with working heat and regular meals, and a foster parent who had read his file and called him by name without being prompted. A modest improvement in the world, as improvements go, but an improvement that accumulated meaning the more you sat with it. He set the photograph beside the older one, the stern-jawed one, and looked at both. Two versions of the same man. The one who grinned, early and easy, in the desert sun. And the one who had become something durable and fixed and certain over years of being tested and holding. Leo thought about which version he was, at 16. He thought he was probably somewhere in the middle. Still in the process of the becoming, still adding miles, still carrying things, still figuring out what the jaw settled into when the performance fell away and only the real thing was left. He put on the ring. He looked at the skull, the crown, the two words, Reaper's blood. He went to his desk and opened his chemistry textbook. Outside, somewhere on the street, the distant sound of a motorcycle engine turned over in the cold spring air, one beat, two, settling into a patient rumble, and then fading as it moved away down the block, unhurried, going somewhere with the absolute confidence of a thing that knows its direction. Leo turned the page and read.